Thank you for being here at the conference. Again, this is a great opportunity to talk about my first time teaching, and the topic that I wanted to present on was student first impressions and the influence on education. So we'll jump right in. There's two big questions here today that we want to talk about. One is, how much do first impressions really matter? Now, we all grew up and your mom and dad always said make a good first impression. If you're going on a job interview, first impressions matter. We all know that. They talk about on resumes that somebody might only look at that for maybe a few seconds and make a decision. So there's lots of ways that first impressions matter. But specifically in education is what we want to talk about today. Now, the next thing, the big question is, if you have this big first impression, then how is that going to matter? How much does it matter? And then how does it consider it for the first impression, right? So how do we approach the first day of class is where I'm really getting at. So if you know it's going to be critical for a first impression, then how do you approach that first day of class? Now, once those first impressions are formed, some of the literature has found that it may be the first few minutes of the first class or maybe even the first few seconds. Part of that's based on personality. So there's some of the researchers in the past, Rosenthal and Bondi, actually they came up with this way of looking at thin slices of photos or images. And they would present these to students. And they got down to where literally only a few seconds, 3 to 6 seconds of the first image, because it is a lot to do with personality. So again, critical that first impression, when you walk into the classroom on the first day, you've got to make a good first impression. Okay? The second thing that came up in the research was that from Laws et al. And Lockhart et al. Was that you'll really have this first impression, it'll remain the whole class, the whole term, the whole semester, whichever one you're working in. And so that's hard to imagine that first day. So again, if you showed up on the first day, you were tired, you weren't energetic, if you just took the syllabus out and went blah, blah, blah through the syllabus, that's what folks are going to remember. And that affects them through the whole semester. So keep that in mind. First impressions, first day, first few minutes, come in with energy, come in with excitement. Make sure that you really approach the students and engage the students from the very beginning. The next thing that's amazing out of the literature was that Cornelius and White found that you're going to have cognitive achievement and learning outcomes of the student are affected even in that first few minutes. Okay? Students make a decision. I'm really going to like this class. I'm not. Wow, this is great. I'm going to learn something. Or I'm not. In the very first few minutes. So again, cognitive achievement, learning outcomes, those things are affected by the student. And then that translates into how the educator, how effective is the educator? Whether they like the educator or whether it's going to end up being effective or not. The next point is that, does that really matter with just students or is it everybody? So the human mind, there's studies by Lord et al. And Blairhoff that are long-standing studies in psychology that the subsequent information is biased. So we get that first impression, it's like a weighted average. So we make a first strong impression, other information comes along and is biased under it and it doesn't pull the weight down. If we start with a low first impression, other information coming in, it takes a lot of information to bring that first impression up. So that's really the basis. It's what's happening in our minds when we take first impressions and then subsequent information. So we always give validity to preceding information, a bias against the new information. The next thing is that came out of the literature from Mann and Ferguson is that it takes something dramatically different to change a first impression. So when students, or all of us, but students in particular, because we're talking about education, they make that first impression, then the educator has to really work hard to change it if it's a negative first impression. Again, if it's a positive first impression, great, and it gets you a little bit of a break going through the rest of the semester because we all have bad days here and there. Again, first impressions matter. Make a great one on the first day, the first few minutes of the class, or else you will have to dramatically change that somehow, some way. The next thing that comes along is that these first impressions, they set the tone for the whole semester. That can positively affect the educator's end of the term evaluations. So again, that can go into career path, that can go into tenure, that can go into promotions, whatever it is. But it's amazing that very first day of class, very first minutes will affect a professor or educator's education in the classroom, but also their own performance and their own promotions later on. Now, how does that work? It sounds like a lot, it's hard to see. But the way to get around this, or the way to work it, is to engage the students from the very minute they walk in on the first day. You want to create a positive atmosphere. That helps to build trust in the instructor, and then it increases the learning outcomes of the student. So it's a plus for both the students, it's a plus for the educator. The whole course will end up going better with that first impression being positive. So what we did in Anderson in a class for negotiation skills, and the topic negotiation. So I took 2 different classes, and we used an example of how to not manipulate, but how to set the stage of this engagement. So in one of the classes, negotiation skills, we had a predetermined set of grading criteria and just read the syllabus and said, here's the class, go for it. The other class, we actually took and allowed the students to negotiate the grading. They actually came into the first day of class, broke them into different groups, and said, you guys negotiate the grades. Now the instructor, myself, we set out the parameters of that and then worked off that from a start. So we had a list of characteristics we were going to grade on and a preset grading, the same as in the other class, but then we let the students negotiate. So this was a great activity. It was a great icebreaker. The students, some of them knew each other in class, some of them didn't. So in groups, they had to first day learn each other's names and about each other. They had to participate in negotiations, and it allowed some autonomy in the class. So the students actually looked at the grading structure as well as the quiz structure and exam structure. Now by that, specifics, what we did is we took, in this column on the screen, we show initial and final. And the different characteristics that we were looking at were preparation, class participation, quizzes, write-ups, and exams. And so there was an initial set of data, as you can see on the screen, set forth, and then there was some changes in the final version. So when you look at this, the biggest difference was in the quizzes. The students wanted, the initial class was preset to be 4 quizzes, 10% grading. The students and the ones that negotiated their grades wanted 7 out of 10. They wanted to take 10 quizzes, 1 a week, but at lower grading per quiz, and they wanted 3 to drop. So they ended up with 7 instead of 4 and weighted it at 15%. So that was one difference. The other one was class participation, which was interesting because the class participation original grade was 20%. The students in the negotiating class wanted it to be 30%. Now, a lot of that was because of students which have a higher natural outgoing personality. So they wanted to get their part. They wanted a higher grade based on their personality. So some of the students who are more reserved in class, they wanted to keep that down. They wanted exams to count more. So the students actually had to negotiate that during the process of the first day of class. So the class went on. We did some quizzes, some exams, participation, and about midway through the class, we gave an assessment to the students in the group that was actually did the negotiation. And in that, the feedback was very positive. The students actually, their biggest question was on the quizzes, because they didn't think they thought the quizzes small would have helped them, and they came back and said, no, the quizzes were actually harder than they thought, so they ended up using some more of their drops in the first half of the course, so there's some unintended consequences there. But in total, the students actually were very positive in the feedback. The biggest thing was the students said, we knew, we negotiated, we wanted this, so then we held ourselves accountable, which was an interesting outcome. Now, the end of the term semester evaluations that are more statistical validity, those came back that Class A, which actually did the negotiations, came back at like a 4.5 on average for the whole class, which was very, very high. The class that did not do the negotiations going in came back at like a 3.8 on average. So there was some difference in positive upside for the class that negotiated. They felt more autonomy, they felt more like they owned the class, and then they lived with the results. So they were more engaged through the whole semester. Some of the implications of this study, it confirms some of the original data in the findings of the literature that yes, the first impressions in students is critical to their learning outcomes, and it's critical to the end of the term evaluations. So those things were confirmed. Part of the problems with this study is it's a very limited sample. It was just 2 classes, only a few students in each class relative to the overall population. So there's sample bias in that. So very small sample size. And the assessment tool that was used was not systematically, statistically validated. So those are 2 things that we can work on in the future. But how do we really grow this study? How do we make it more statistical validity? How do we actually use it in the future? So we want to replicate the study for different classes, especially when you have the same semester, 2 courses or 2 sections of the same course, and then you can test an activity at the beginning of the first day so that you can one with and one without. But again, that's just very small sample size. So we really need to build a database. We need other professors, other educators to be involved in this study to sort of test engagement and no engagement on the first day, and then how those outcomes play out through the rest of the semester. So that'll help build statistical validity, it'll help take out the bias, and it'll just add to the whole community of literature on this subject matter. So again, thank you for your time. I appreciate the information. You're allowing me to share the opportunity to be here and just help remember the few things. It is critical, your very first day, very first few minutes, make a positive impression. If, however, you have a bad first day, you've got to do something dramatically different through the semester to change that. But in any way, the impressions, positive or negative, are going to affect the student's learning, and they will affect your outcome at the end of the semester, long-term, your career opportunities. Thank you. Any questions?